Let's talk now, though, to Mr. Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. It's time for our regular weekly chat, which has turned into one of the very few places where you can hear the truth about what's going on. Peter, a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I thought I enjoyed your column this weekend about Rule Britannia because there was a certain irony. I mean, I was boots and all stuck into it last week because I just thought I've had enough of this nonsense, and this is why we're going to see Rule Britannia as the final straw of the kind of woke brigade at the BBC. But you're right. I mean, it is kind of ironic that we want to sing about freedom without actually having it.
Well, yeah, indeed. There's a great contempt for freedom. I go around and I see huge numbers of people, for instance, willingly wearing face nappies, in some cases, as far as I see, enthusiastically, for which there's very little medical justification, but is a sign of submission to the authority of the state, which bridles me. I just can't. I can't see how some brought up as British could bring themselves to behave in this fashion, but they do, and in lots of other ways as well. People have been completely and utterly subjugated by fear, and this is not just the uneducated. It's often highly educated people, and I've come across both sorts. A shopkeeper yesterday who refused to let me into his shop without a muzzle.
Oh, really?
I've said I'm exempt.
Right.
And he said, "Not here, you're not. This is my home." I said, "Well, it looks like a shop to me." He said, "Well, it is, in fact, my home. My kids come in here," he said, as if children were tremendously at risk from COVID-19.
Which they're, of course, not.
As if I were a toxic site, which I'm also not.
Yeah.
In the end, I mean, I didn't go in because what's the point? So I bought my newspaper somewhere else that morning. But it was his view of the whole thing was no more ill-informed, hysterical and ignorant than that of university graduates and teachers whom I know, who take the same view. And the power of the fear over people's minds is immense. And there was a protest on Saturday. And, of course, at this protest, there are all kinds of weirdos, beyond doubt. The British Union of Fascist banner, and I think David Icke
was there,
there's a loopy-loo sorts. But I think there were also, as there were a similar one in Berlin, quite a large number of people genuinely perplexed by what's happening to the country. And a really astonishing thing happened afterwards, which has been very lightly reported in the newspapers today, that Piers Corbyn, that's Jeremy Corbyn's brother, who was the organizer, was grabbed by the police at the end of this demonstration. I mean, literally grabbed, and fined £10,000 under new laws restricting public gatherings of more than 30 people. It sounds to me like the Greek colonels. Parliament, I don't believe, has published a law allowing someone to be fined £10,000 without trial for organising a demonstration, which was, as far as I know, peaceful.
Yes.
And which
it was only
consulted with the police for days beforehand.
Yeah, and it was also only one of
no attempt at illegality going on.
No, also one of several marches that went on at the weekend, of which he seems to be the only recipient of a fine. It would not come as any surprise to you, Peter, that we discussed this in the first hour, because I do cover these things, and despite many of my colleagues in the media not doing so, I do. I'm no great fan of Piers Corbyn. You know, I think he is a borderline sort of on the nutty side of things. However, if they're going to fine him, surely they have to fine the organisers of the Black Lives Matter march, which took place, and also the Extinction Rebellion crowd, who I think are out and about today.
Well, I'm sure they are, but when one remembers the police handling of them in the days before all this is tremendously feeble.
Yeah.
You can't help but seeing a political bias in the behaviour of the police towards this. And also, almost all the accounts of the demonstration have concentrated upon the presence of loonies.
Yeah.
Which is the sort of thing that the press of a country like Belarus does.
Yeah.
If there's a demonstration, they're described as fringe nutcases.
Yeah.
I think we should be a good... there was a report on the BBC which verged on the openly bias of it. I think we should be very, very suspicious of these developments. I say one of the principal freedoms of a free country is the freedom of assembly. And it was bizarre that from the very start of this, it was one of the things the government concentrated on legislating against freedom of assembly. And yet, as we know, as we just mentioned, that with the Black Lives Matter particularly, this was and indeed with the tearing down of the famous statue in Bristol, this was absolutely not enforced.
No. Well, I mean, one of the things that amused me highly, I don't know if you saw this, but the opening paragraph of the Guardian's report into the Black Lives Matter march. Let me just read this to you. Hundreds of demonstrators took to the streets of West London on Sunday in the first ever million people march. Now, I don't know about you, but 400 people is quite a lot short of 1 million people. But
Well, there is that.
But they do refer to it as a million people march, even though there was only 400 people there. You know, that also came on top of what I saw from some members of the BBC, to wit Lewis Goodall and Nick Robinson, complaining about the Mail on Sunday's page one about the possibility of a sort of right-leaning television station covering news being launched, with Nick Robinson entreating people to complain to Ofcom about it before it's even started.
Well, good heavens! I mean,
it's incredible, isn't it?
It is. I didn't hear that, but it is extraordinary. But the BBC, I think, has finally come up against what it was eventually bound to hit. And I used to defend it, as I say. I felt that it was necessary to have a public service broadcaster to maintain standards and keep everybody honest. But I've just given up now. I can't defend it anymore.
It's very difficult. Very difficult.
But the business about the Rule Britannia is fascinating. The attempts by the BBC to remove patriotic songs from the last night of the proms began in 1969. It is not a new thing.
Right.
I can just remember the first time I can remember watching the last night of the proms. I've dated it. It must have been 1960. Because the wonderful Constance Shacklock, a name which you can't forget once you've heard it, was singing the opening solo of Rule Britannia.
Right.
In fact, there's a very crackly version of this on YouTube in which she actually pronounces Azure as Azure.
Oh, excellent.
Which I can't remember happening, but it's so antiquated as to be marvelous. But it's thrilling to hear because she sings all the verses, which nobody would do now.
No, of course.
And but at that time in 1960, before Hugh Carlton Green and his Bloomsbury boys got control of the BBC, it was still a national broadcaster, and I can still remember it being such. And it's then once Green came in the early 60s and really got going, that's when it all got torn to pieces.
Well, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when at the end of the broadcast night, whatever time it was usually just after midnight, I think, they would play God Save the Queen. That would be the last thing they did.
Yeah, and they used to do that in cinemas as well.
Yeah.
And there was a famous episode where Tariq Ali, as a young left-wing student in Oxford, was with his with several of his friends from Pakistan, watching a film in a cinema in Oxford. And they played, this would have been about 1967, they played God Save the Queen in the end, and he and his friends, being well-mannered boys, stood up and were pelted with rotten apples and rubbish by the other people at the cinema, shouting fascist at them.
Oh, I know.
It's been a long time in certain areas of our society. It's been a long time, this loathing of any public expression of patriotism. I think they dropped God Save the Queen from the cinemas about 1968.
Yes, I think that's about right. But I mean, the funny thing is that you've also written in your column this week about a magazine that you used to write for in America, which urged you to edit one of the paragraphs in a piece you'd written because it was a bit too, shall we say, anti-establishment on COVID lockdown.
That's absolutely right, and it's shocking. This is a small magazine, partly online, partly not. You can read a lot of the stuff for free, but others it's called First Things. It's mainly actually Roman Catholic, but it goes into all kinds of other things. I've done lots of stuff for it, book reviews particularly, which allow me to go at full length. And I've had a lot of fun doing it, and they've been nice to work for. And I do a monthly column for them, which this was, and which you can find on my blog. You can see the outrageous thing which I was asked to tone down, and I said no. I thought, and they said, well, perhaps you could write about something else. I said, look, if I do that, then everything else I ever write for you will be written in the fear that I'll provoke the censorship again. I can't do it. This is the end. I've got to leave. And I'm appealing to people to go the First Things mag on Twitter. Anybody who reads it or anybody who's written to it to write to them politely and say, look, you can't do this. Right. Because there are obviously people there who must hate this, and they need to be strengthened by expressions of public dissent. Censorship is and for it to reach, for the hairy, thuggish hand of censorship to reach into such what you would have thought was such a gentle place.
Well, indeed,
tells you just how far we have descended from being free societies in the past 6 months.
But I think an awful lot of it as well, Peter, is due to the kind of overreach of not just government, but of people who think that they're doing the right thing. like you also referred to a complaint you've made to the Advertising Standards Authority about an ad which I've seen where a woman's wearing a face mask and is saying, I wear this to protect you, please wear yours to protect me.
That's right.
And as you point out, there's no evidence to back any of that up. If you want to be polite, wear a mask. As I've said to you before, I do it if I go into a supermarket, although there are other people in the supermarket not wearing them, but I don't wear one. I went into a garage the other day because I wanted to get a bottle of water, and I didn't wear one, and nobody said anything, and nobody cared. So, there's this kind of overreach, I think, by organisations like Advertising Standards and by corporations in particular who think they're doing the right thing,
well,
based on nothing.
Advertising Standards have actually accepted. They haven't ruled in favour of my complaint, but they could, as they've done to me in the past, they could have just bounced it back and said we're not looking at this.
Right.
But they have both accepted it as a legitimate complaint and sent it up to their council, which is their highest body. So they are taking it seriously, and they have had some. They did do some pretty serious censuring of somebody who was selling face masks a few months ago, saying they'd overstated their benefits. So they are aware of this, and it was interesting. But the problem with this advertisement is it looks terribly attractive young woman saying, "I'm doing this for you," and the wearing the face covering. But it looks all very nice and benevolent, but it can lead, and I think it does lead in some parts of the country to people who are not wearing face coverings being harassed by people who are, on the grounds that you're not doing your duty as a citizen, you're being selfish, you're killing me. And the danger of being mobbed, I mean, it's not going to happen to you or me, but you can imagine it could particularly happen to women. And there was a recent fascinating article in The Guardian about this very particular problem which some women who've been raped have over putting on a face covering. They absolutely hate it because it brings back memories of a hand being clamped across their face. Yeah. And it's not a particularly, alas, uncommon problem. And there it is. And somebody who was in that position could find themselves being mobbed in a supermarket by people who think they are doing good by saying, you should be wearing a mask. And a person faced with that, particularly someone who's undergone that sort of situation, could find themselves totally overwhelmed with grief and fear.
And yet we are still...
And no sympathy from anybody. And that's the danger of this sort of advertising.
Yes, indeed. But because we are still in this kind of rather obscure place where you and I have reached quite a lot of agreement on this, not surprisingly, where we both believe that the most important aspect now of these figures that we're given of infections is how many of them are actually sick. We've got this ridiculous case of the flight from Zante in Greece that has come back to Cardiff, where 7 people on that flight were apparently found to have the virus, but we're not told in what way they have it or whether any of them have had to go to hospital. Well, and now they're going to quarantine everybody.
I take this view now. Wherever I hear these figures trotted out, if it's not added that a number of them have been hospitalised or are ill, then I assume that they are all asymptomatic and well. As we know, the principal characteristic of the disease COVID-19 in almost all the cases which are now affecting the country is that you're perfectly fine. Yeah. And the fact that they don't mention the medical state of these people suggests strongly to me that they are not suffering from anything serious. And I think we until they start giving these figures out as a matter of course and saying none of them has actually been ill, none of them has been hospitalised, none of them has died, then we'll just have to assume that's what they mean. Because if they're not saying it, it's because they don't want to say it. Right. And my own city of Oxford is being menaced with an amber alert because I think something like 40 people out of a city population of 150,000 have tested positive. The response of the authorities to this has been, wouldn't you just guess to open a new testing centre? Right. There was already a perfectly adequate testing centre, if you like that sort of thing, up in the north of the city next to one of the railway stations. But at the weekend, they specially opened another one next to a big Tesco's off the Cali Road, which is the main artery in the town rather than the Gown area of the city. And why were they doing that? And presumably, I know people who've been in the past few days written to twice and texted by the authorities urging them to go and get tested. Yeah. Well, why are they doing this? Well, do they actually want to get the numbers up? Well, because if they don't, what is the explanation for this otherwise?
Well, exactly right. And they want to talk about track and trace, and nobody knows where the 7 people on the plane got it from. Some people are suggesting they may have got it on the plane. in which case presumably they'll stop everybody from flying on a plane. But let me read you this. This is from an email from my son's school, right? And this is on face masks. In order to promote the highest levels of safety, we would ask that all students wear a face mask when moving between lessons and when moving around communal areas within the school buildings. However, face masks should be removed when seated in class to help to facilitate high-quality teaching and learning. I mean, if that doesn't spell nonsense to you, I don't know what does.
It's double nonsense. Apart from anything else, these masks, if you constantly handle them, they're worse than useless. The proper surgical masks, the ones which I'm constantly told are comparable, the ones used in hospitals, are tightly fitted and quite uncomfortable to wear, and the people who wear them are trained never to touch them.
Yeah.
But you see constantly people with these loose face masks touching them. And if people are going from classroom to another classroom down a corridor or wherever they're going, they put the mask on, they take it off again, they put it off again. Are they going to have a store of 17 masks for the whole day, or are they just going to wear the same one? Are they going to handle it?
Well, also,
what's the point of it?
And also, what is the point of taking it off in the classroom when you have to wear it in the corridor? I just don't understand it.
Well, it's unsustainable, isn't it? And it's part of this hysteria. And I say it again: if this thing is as serious as they say it is on the most tiny evidence, then it really is time we started taking more precautions against people being killed by eagles dropping tortoises on their heads. I mean, my own plan is that all the tortoises in the country should be thickly greased so that the eagles won't be able to pick them up.
Or stuck to the ground or something.
I'm thinking of setting up a tortoise grease manufacturing company for this purpose, because the people who are making face masks and hand sanitizer are doing very well, it seems.
Well, they certainly are. There's always plenty of opportunities.
You could smear your tortoise with hand sanitizer.
Well, that might be the way to go, yeah. But here's the other thing, right? Let me ask you about the tax implications here, because you and I have also spoken about the need to pay the piper, as it were. Rishi Sunak appears to be sort of setting out the groundwork for that. I have no doubt that a lot of his suggestions are just simply that, and he's going to kind of try and gauge which bits the public will buy. But, I mean, the idea to raise corporation tax, for example, on small businesses by a factor of more than 25% in one fell swoop seems crazy.
Well, I saw one paper saying this would destroy the recovery, and I said, what recovery?
Right.
This is after last week, Pret a Manger, a sandwich bar, sacked thousands of people, and after, again, returning to my home city, the mini plant in Oxford began to sack people making cars. There is no recovery. There's the absolute opposite of a recovery. But I think the problem is, if these tax rises don't take place, then the other thing will happen, which is there will be no money to run the public services,
right.
Not least the NHS we're supposed to be so concerned about. So absolutely everything that people rely on will be starved of money. And if you say, well, that road hasn't been repaired, or the hospital's a slum, and the lavatories leak, and all the rest of it, people will say, well, we're sorry. But the cuts, the COVID cuts, which we're going to come up against, the COVID cuts mean we can't afford to fix that. We can't afford to hire the people. We can't afford to keep people employed. And we will live in a society with a much, much lower standard of living because of this. And the other thing which is going to happen, and you think you can escape it, maybe if the tax raids are postponed, is that, of course, the inflation, which I think is now absolutely bound to happen because they've pumped quantitative easing into the public purse for the first time. People are getting money in their pockets from the government in the Rishi Sunak schemes. That has launched a huge amount of money into the open market rather than just the bond market or wherever it was before. And inflation will mean that whatever savings you may have, which of course includes the pension which you hope to live on in your later years, will be shriveled to nothing.
Yeah.
And only people who have assets will survive it. And this is another terrible thing, which people because I'm afraid economics is not even taught adequately in most of our schools to most people, will take people by horrible surprise when it comes. But it's so visible to anybody who knows what's going on.
Well, similarly, the people who work from home, who say it's all very fine and dandy because they feel much better and they don't have to commute anywhere, their jobs will disappear. If in fact the places that they put their supposed money into in the city are no longer recipients of that, and the pension funds will diminish, and therefore the insurance funds will diminish, and everything will diminish to the point where nobody has a job.
Well, so if employers can be, if it really is working so well, if employers can get people to work for them who never come into work, for whom they don't have to provide offices or facilities, then they'll say, all right, well, we'll hire many, many more freelancers, and all the remaining jobs which used to have some security and which used to have some perks and which used to have national insurance payments and all the rest, will go.
Yeah.
And there will be a nation of freelancers totally at the mercy of tomorrow, with no job security at all and very little in the way of social protection.
And with no pension,
this will be
no holiday pay, no sick pay, nothing.
No, nothing like that. Why, what are you asking for a holiday for? You're at home all the time anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
You can just imagine the response of any employer to request for holiday from people, but they will be asked to revise their contract.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very worrying time. However, I take the view, and not many people do, because people would call it irresponsible, that we shouldn't bother paying the money back. Whoever we borrowed it from, and I don't think anybody really understands how much £1 trillion is anyway, whoever we borrowed it from, we should just say we're not paying it back. It doesn't really matter. There's no point in paying it back. It's such a big number that we could never pay it back. So let's just carry on as normal. Just keep borrowing. And people go, oh, but then your children will have to pay the price. Well, then maybe they could worry about that in 50 years' time. But we don't have to worry about it now.
It'll be sooner than that, Mike. I was going to say the simplest answer to that is we are borrowing from the future, and we are borrowing from our children. But it will come much sooner than 50 years' time.
Yes, but the point is that
what
it's
you're
such a
basically
big
saying
number.
is you're bequeathing to your own self, if you live long enough, and to your children and grandchildren, and there's many, you're bequeathing to them horrible economic consequences. The only real problem with the argument is this: the damage is largely already done. It's not. You cannot strangle a major service economy for nearly 6 months and reduce it almost to nothing, and expect at the end of that that you haven't done. As I say, it is like a heart attack.
Yes,
it's not treated very quickly, then it does permanent, deep damage.
Yes, no, I agree with that. But this is why.
There's been the reverse of quick treatment. The thing has just been neglected.
But this is
allowed to continue.
But this is what I'm hopeful, that once the schools go back, once they stop paying the furlough money, that people will actually see sense and they'll stop this ridiculous kind of selfish attitude of, well, I don't need to go to work, I don't need to commute, I much prefer doing it this way. Well, no, that won't be available anymore, so you'll have to come back.
If there's anything to come back to.
Well,
and there's the problem. What has frightened me from the start of this is that this is just the first stage of the dislocation. You've got used to a much more interfering state of being ordered about, of having far less freedom to do what you like, and also society as it previously was has been broken up, so we don't see each other anymore. Now comes the sort of 1929, 1931 moment, when after the crash comes the unemployment and comes the economic devastation.
And then you can't afford to see each other.
I think it's that period of our history we need to look at,
yeah.
the period which in which we ended up with a national government in which the Labour Party tore itself to pieces, and in which millions of people became unemployed, and large parts of British industry went into a decline from which a lot of it never recovered. And it took the war to re-stimulate the economy really after that, and that seems to me to be the position towards which we're drifting. And in those days we were a far, far more restrained, better behaved people than we are now, and I genuinely fear for social peace.
Yes.
When this
well,
comes.
You'll be happy to know that we've now found at least one more other way of disagreeing, because I don't think my freedom has been in any way affected massively. I still don't. I think putting a mask on to go into the supermarket for 15 minutes to buy a few bottles of wine and some olives is not really going to bother me so much that I have to talk about my freedoms being, somehow curtailed. Whereas you obviously feel stronger about that.
Well, can I explain why?
Go on.
It's not just a matter of putting a piece of cloth on your face. It's a matter of the state reaching into areas of your life which are none of its business. And also, it is the wearing of these things, largely futile as it mostly is much more a declaration of assent to the government's policies. And the other thing which it does is it helps to spread fear. The fear which was created deliberately back in March, after that extraordinary SAGE document that we've discussed, which was undoubtedly created deliberately, was flagging a bit. And the introduction of face coverings at a time when deaths from COVID had fallen to very close to zero was a bizarre thing. If you really, really believed in them, which nobody did, then they would have been introduced months ago. But they were introduced not to deal with the spread of COVID, but to actually blow on the embers of public fear and to spread the idea that we are living in a crisis. And that's the problem with it. You're asked both to submit to a state acting like the parent of a child, saying, you must wear this. You're supposed to wear publicly in a very visible place a symbol of your submission to an acceptance of a government policy, and you cooperate in the spreading and fanning of the fear from which this government distills its power.
No, okay.
That's what's wrong with it.
Okay, well, listen, I get that, but I'm being told we have to run because we're out of time. But listen, Peter, great to talk to you again. Thank you. We'll pick it up again next Monday. There's always lots to say.